president. I struggle. The Olympic Committee. Oh yeah, we're going there. Mocks the Last Supper. We spend our energy incensed at them. In a post-Christian world, we have so many opportunities to work out the muscles of judgment. But how will the church retain her fragrance of mercy? This morning, we're going to look at David and Israel's response to Saul's death. And we're going to learn two fundamental truths about mercy. The first is that we cannot know God's verdict on man's life. We cannot know. And the second, that God elects some for the salvation of others. Let's jump into the text. The Philistines are in the north fighting against Saul's men. They overwhelm them, they kill Saul's sons, and the archers pierce Saul through many times with arrows. But he takes his own life with his own sword before they get to him. Saul told his own story as a tragedy. And the period to end the story of his life was written with the point of his own sword. Commentators, especially modern preachers, have joined Saul in describing his own life as a clear tragedy. A man fallen from grace, damned in his sin, damned in his suicide. And there are good reasons for judgment for Saul's life. Saul was a man who had to always be in control of his own destiny. As Father Josh said last week, he did not wait upon the Lord. And perhaps that's no more clear than in this passage today. He laid his hand against God's anointed himself. He took his sword and he thrust himself through. Overcome by his own failures, afraid, blind to God in that moment, he ends his own life. That's Saul in a nutshell, a modern preacher might say. Now that we've told the tragedy of that sinner, now that we have put the damning period on his life, we can roll up the scroll and put it on the shelves of stories. I think I'll put this one on the tragedy section, not the comedy section. Embedded in the countless sermons that I saw as I looked up, trying to get some lead on this text this week, is embedded the belief that we can know God's verdict on a man's life. We can. Saul is more complex than this. And my hope is that you will come away from this sermon thinking and knowing that all things are more complex. And if you can understand this thought, you will have something of a foundation for mercy. You might remember, for instance, that Saul did not want to be king. He hid behind the luggage. It was imposed upon him by Samuel, his fellow countrymen, and in a sense by God. He didn't want this elevation. Once he had it, he had a brilliant start by calling together the men of Jabesh. Remember that name? They come in the story. By calling together the whole nation to arise to defend the men of Jabesh, filled with the Spirit of the Lord, it says. His fall from grace was twofold. He sacrificed animals to the Lord before a battle, and he withheld the best of the animals of the Amalekites in order to sacrifice them to the Lord. I think we can assume that his intentions were probably pretty good. Foolish, not right. But I've done worse things than that. Haven't you? Remember, too, that in addition to the terrible strain of being king and the normal temptation and affliction that Satan focuses on men of power, Saul also had an evil spirit that was sent, according to the text, by God himself. But what about his suicide? Surely his suicide allows us to make a final judgment on this vile man and put him away, outside the pale of grace, to put a period on the tragedy and bind the book. For good reason, we see suicide as a definitive act of damnation, a period at the end of a tragedy. Why? Because suicide is taking all that God has given us and saying, no thank you. It is the exact opposite of the Eucharist, which is every person's calling to give to God a great thank you. That's what Eucharist means, thank you, for all that he has received. Thus, the Church most often denies a full Christian burial and funeral in cases when a man rises up with a clear mind and rejects his own life. But is that what's happening here? The Hebrew says that the battle weighed heavy on Saul. The Greek uses the word traumatizo. He had just watched his 3 sons die in battle. He was surrounded by Philistines, pierced already with multiple arrows, possessed by an evil spirit. I'd call that a disadvantage person. It is never morally permissible to do what Saul did. But there are sins of infirmity, and there are sins of malice. The Lord looks upon them differently. Sometimes we sin because we are weak, overwhelmed by naivety, habit, or passion. These are sins of infirmity. Other times we sin with false strength, with clear minds. We act out of intention, a crime of premeditation versus a crime of passion. These sins are called high-handed sins, sins of malice. Now, many actions are mixed, both, and we just can't put a definitive sense and parse out each action. But there is reason for pause here with Saul, and that's my point in going down this path. Perhaps God has shown Saul mercy. In fact, in reading over this text over and over again the last couple weeks, I found my heart taking a different path than most of the sermons that I was reading online. I felt my heart become moved to pray for Saul. It's hard to explain, but I felt an overwhelming compassion and pity for him. I asked in preparation for this sermon that this man who lived 3,000 years ago, that God would have mercy on him, to look past his mistakes. And the more I read of this book, the more I saw that this impulse is correct. Because even though Saul was ready to draw the period of his own tragedy with the point of his sword, and even though most modern preachers are ready to cast Saul upon the dusty shelf of tragedy, that is not how God's people treated Saul in the text. They did not write a tragedy, nor a comedy. Instead, they lifted up the life of this broken man in smoke and in song. They had the fragrance of mercy. Let me read for you. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. In this action, they are taking the very complex, non-impressive life of this man, and they are offering him visually up to God. Then they took his bones and they buried him under the tree of Jabesh and fasted 7 days. In the next book, 2 Samuel, which was all one book at one time, David, it says, lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. He wrote a song called the Song of the Bow. The Song of the Bow. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And he instructed and made it a law that all of the children of Judah, for perpetuity, would learn the song that he wrote about Saul, that guy that had treated him so well. Here's how the song went. The beauty of Israel is slain upon the high places. How mighty are the fallen. Skipping ahead. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. Keeping on going. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. Does that sound like mercy to you? Did David write a tragedy? Did he do a jackknife on Saul? He had every reason to. Saul was despicable to David. Yet God's church has the fragrance of mercy. So what do we learn from this? The lives of men are not to be judged definitively. They are to be lifted up to God in smoke and in song. Their successes are to be commended, and we are to pray to God's mercy for their failures. Saul's funeral was performed by the men of Jabesh, and David's song. These two actions were more like a closing semicolon to his story. Smoke and song are not judgments. They leave the final period up to God. Our job is to merely give oblations. It is for us to consider all men with mercy, to speak well of them in life and in death. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged. The measure that you use against so-and-so will be used against you. Do not give in to the temptation of allowing a person's worst or final act define their story. Do not do this to yourselves. Do not do this to others." As it pertains to our own individual stories, there are no tragedies and comedies. All we have are smoke and songs, offered up, sometimes confidently, as in the case of Fritz. We know where Fritz is. And sometimes with doubt, like I'm sure it was the case with Saul. Slim hope in God's mercy. Thus, we learn from this text one of the key principles of mercy. We cannot know God's verdict on a man's life. But to switch to the second half of this homily, it doesn't follow the fourfold sense very well. God does not leave us with mere agnosticism. The Bible doesn't leave us as mere suppliants of God's mercy. God, invites us to be co-redeemers with Him, which is the second part of this homily on mercy, that God elects some, He chooses some, for the salvation of others, and that this truth undergirds the church's fragrance of mercy. We don't often see it this way. We tend to think about people as isolated comedies and tragedies, elect and damned. But that is not what the Bible teaches. Take, for example, Abram's election. He was elect. Out of all the families of the earth, Abram was elect. His comedy, this writing of his story, was a tacit rejection of the rest of the world, the non-election of the rest of the world. But was their non-election, in contrast to Abram's election, was it their damnation? Was it? Of course it wasn't. That would be ridiculous to see election that way. Abram's election was for the blessing and inclusion in that blessing of the rest of the world. That's obvious when you read the text. So you see that their not being chosen was not their tragedy. Their destiny was to be included by the action of the blessed, the elect, into the comedy that God was writing for His people. And this was true of the people of Israel as well, the whole nation. Their election as God's people was for the inclusion of the rest of the world in their promises. Now, they didn't do that, and that's why Jesus came and was so angry with them. They didn't treat their election as a blessing for the rest of the world. They did not have the fragrance of, what's our word? David had every reason to think of himself as accepted and Saul as rejected and to be done with him. But we see that throughout the scriptures, God's election is for the blessing of all. Paul explains this dynamic in Romans 9 through 11. Romans 9 through 11. He uses the story that's fleshed out in our gospel reading with the older and younger brother, the story of Jacob and Esau, or Esau and Jacob. And Paul uses the types of Jacob and Esau as types for the Gentiles and Jews. We read in them, Jacob have I loved, and Esau have I hated. Well, there you have it. God writes comedies and tragedies, periods at the end. Jacob have I loved, Esau, tragic. Many take it that way. But the purpose of Jacob's election, his comedy, was to graft in Esau's rejection. This is how Paul explains it in Romans 9 through 11. He says, "For just as you, Gentiles, Jacob, were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of the Jews' disobedience, so they now have been disobedient, rejected, in order that the mercy shown to you might cause them jealousy, that they might receive mercy in the end." He has a weird phrase in them that in the end, the election of the Gentiles will mean the salvation of all Israel. We don't know what that means, but he clarifies something at the end. He says, if the dough, the Gentiles, the Jacob, the chosen, the elect ones, the church, if the dough, which is offered as a first fruit, is holy, so is the whole lump. This truth is what gives the church her fragrance of mercy. For us, there are no determined comedies and tragedies. There is only the mission of the chosen to offer up smoke and song on behalf of the rejected, in longing and labor that they too might find their place in God's choice. Abram, Jacob, the Israelites, David, they were all elect, very obviously chosen, blessed, in order to be a blessing, which means that they were to take the rejected, the non-elect world, and graft them in to their own election. All of this points to Jesus, who Paul talks about repeatedly as the only elect one. That all of us, he uses the word co over and over again. The phrase in him as the only blessed. Jesus, who enfolds all of us rejects. Raise your hand if you're a reject. He enfolds all, Luke raised his hand twice. Thank you, Luke. He enfolds all of us would-be rejects into himself. All of our would-be tragedies find themselves in his one great comedy, his redemption of the world. This means that we do not have a mission of judgment, but of mercy. For we too were once rejected, as Paul says in Ephesians 2. And now we have found acceptance through Christ our Lord. So what does this mean for how we live? We must avoid the hubris of defining men's lives and stories. It is hubris, like Saul, to define our own life a tragedy. We must avoid the hubris of defining the lives of others as tragedy through judgment and ridicule. A fragrance of mercy will only emanate from a spirit of humility. We are not bookbinders, we are gardeners. We do not draw the point of periods on tragedies. We take dying shoots all around us in our neighborhoods, and we graft them tediously with prayer and labor into the vine of Christ's church. If we see ourselves as God's comedies and the lost, them as God's tragedies, then we will be overcome with pride, hubris. But if we see his acceptance of us as the means of including those who are now rejected, we will have the fragrance of mercy. So do not speak ill of yourself, and especially not others. Pray for them. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor, for you are chosen for him. Do not gossip about people's worst moments. Be as David. Write songs about their best moments. Do not waste your time writing verdicts on stories that only God knows. Every moment spent on that is taking away from the mission of mercy that we have. I'll end briefly with the anagogical, with the thought of heaven. But heaven in a nearer sense than you might expect. The great liturgy of the church. It is here where the great comedy of the world is played out. Do we not offer up all things in smoke and song? This right here is what our election and our acceptance is for. We, the once rejected, now grafted into the chosen one, Jesus Christ, are to be the priests of the whole world, to bring in those who are yet unchosen into the comedy of the chosen Son. Amen.